contract changes on this one. And I've got to pull up the form, so give me a half a second. There really aren't too many major changes. There's nothing that that I want you worried about necessarily, but I did want to make sure that we knew what those changes were and generally what the purpose of those changes were. So hopefully you'll find this very helpful. Let's see if I can share my screen. We're going to get started in just another minute. Just hit 2 o'clock, but I want to make sure I give people enough chances to jump on. Okay, you should be able to see my screen, and I'd be happy to email you all of this. I will probably share this with Drew. I think Terry's out on vacation this week, but I'll share it with Drew. That way, Drew can send it to you when we are all done. Or if you want, you can reach out to me directly. My email is cross@cb.law. That's CROSS@CB, Campbell Brandon .law, and you can reach out to me that way. I'm an attorney in the East Cobb office. I also, you know, I tend to get to know all of you in different areas. So I'm excited to be invited to help. A couple of quick points. There's no CE credit for this or anything like that. This is just going to be a quick 30-minute thing, and we can kind of go into whatever discussion that you find most helpful. But I would recommend you reach out, use this chat feature. You see Ashu's already done that. She said she doesn't want to talk, and I don't blame her. That's fine. But feel free to use the chat session. You can send me a private message as well as a public one so everyone can see it. And then also, you can ask a question under the Q&A. You also raise your hand, and I'd love for you to invite. One thing you'll know if you've come to any of my classes before, I love interaction, and it's actually still possible on these video calls. I find a way. So definitely raise your hand, ask questions if you got it. But let's jump into it. The purpose of this class, why I was asked to help, was to talk about the new changes. Now, most of the changes kind of came about without us noticing them. May 1st was the majority of the changes, and then May 22nd, there were a couple of extra ones that kind of snuck in there. And more than anything, I feel like the last 12 months or so, the Forms Committee has really tried to just lightly tinker with the forms. There's no major changes. We're not experiencing the liquidated damages clause for remedies. We're not seeing anything that's changing the whole landscape of how we do these closings and how we do contracts. So I think that's a good thing. They're able to perfect the language based on feedback. They're able to kind of make it a little clearer. And that is the whole point of these contracts. I've probably told most of you this already, but the reason why the F201 and the lease contract and all these other contracts that we have, the reason why they're so long is to encourage communication. So they're all about making sure, oh, did we talk about what happens if the house burns down? We'll look at section 8 of the 5th page, and it says risk of loss. I don't know if that's the actual section, but you know, it's all about making sure we talked about it, or that your clients talked about it before we actually went under contract, or as a part of that process. And the way I think about it is, if anything changes, if we find out anything, if anything new pops up, well, we have to have an amendment. We have to have a new discussion about that. You know, if oh gosh, we didn't realize the roof was leaking, and maybe the seller didn't either. Let's do an amendment. The seller's going to fix it before closing, or we're just going to reduce the purchase price or take a credit on the closing. So that's how I look at it. Is it's communication between the buyer and the seller, or communication between a landlord tenant, communication between a broker seller or broker buyer. And you know, there's a form for all of that. So all of these are designed to push us in the right direction, to, you know, kind of encourage that good communication, and hopefully make us better at our job. That's the key. That is for sure. So it says my screen sharing is paused. Hold on one second. All right, so here's our first one. This is the main form. I'd be happy to share this so that you guys can have it. But the big one, lead-based paint. You hear about it all the time, must be signed prior to entering into the buying agreement. So don't forget to include this exhibit in the initial e-sign loop with the buyer's offer. And let's look more specifically at what that form says. Here it is, here's a new form, and what you'll notice down at the bottom is it says the new date, May 22nd, 2020. So that's kind of why that's how you know that you've got the most recent form. Let's see if I can go down there. All right, so if we go back, I'm struggling a little bit with this technology. Clear. Okay. All right, so we go back up. Under federal law, this exhibit, they do that just to scare us. This exhibit must be signed by the seller landlord and/or buyer tenant, and the buyer tenant provided a copy of the pamphlet, the lead-based paint pamphlet, prior to the buyer tenant and/or seller landlord entering into a buying agreement. This agreement must be filled out for all housing, excuse me, built prior to 1978. Let me put my mask on so you guys don't get anything. If you notice, this is the mask we're wearing at Campbell and Brannan. This is my, all right, I'll be stop being silly. So there's a lead-based paint. It's just another reminder, get this out as soon as possible. But otherwise, the form hasn't changed. It's just that disclosure. And I'll take this minute to remind you, when I read these forms, when I look at a new exhibit or an exhibit I haven't seen in a while, I'm always looking at the intro paragraph, always, without a doubt, because it sets up the purpose of the form. And in this case, it's very simple. The purpose is to comply with federal law. And what we'll look at later on, when you sign the listing agreement, when you sign the buyer brokerage agreement, it actually, one of your duties is to help the client be disclosed of any federal laws, federal disclosure requirements. So that's a big one. I always look at that intro paragraph because it really sets it up. The other place where I'm always looking at the intro paragraph is the seller disclosure, because it talks about what the duties are and why you're filling this out. You know, it's Georgia law and such things like that. Let's remove that form. Let's go back to our changes. So that's a pretty simple one. That's just the lead-based paint exhibit. Let's go to the big one. This is the one that we probably need to spend the most time on. And let's see what number it is. I don't think it's this one. This is the listing agreement. That's for later. Release, community association disclosure. And remember, don't forget to, pop into the chat feature or anything like that, or raise your hand if you have questions. I don't see anybody just yet. So here's the new community association disclosure form. Generally, it's being enacted the exact same way that it was previously, at least the way Campbell and Brannan handles it. It always made sense to us, but we went right to the source last year. Every time they come up with these new forms, there's always a little bit of room for, interpretation. But if we go to the purpose of the form and we look at the forms committee meetings and how it was taught to us originally, we wanted to be on the same page. And luckily, we were able to kind of disclose that all to you regularly at sales meetings and at all our classes. And what the GAR Forms Committee has done since then is they've now updated the form to hopefully make it even clearer. So again, you'll notice down at the bottom, this is as of May 1st, 2020. So if we look at the highlight of the changes, so they're further clarified that if you forget to enter a number on page 2, item CI, or write NA, that there's a transfer initiation administration fee, the seller will pay 100% of it. That's a big deal. So that's how we've always known it to be, but it's always an issue. It always comes up as a problem on our closing. So again, let's look at the directions for filling out the disclosure. Seller agrees to fill out the disclosure accurately and completely to the best of the seller's knowledge, and to promptly update and provide buyer with a revised copy of the disclosure up until closing if a new information is learned by seller which materially changes the answers herein. So number one, you have to fill it out accurately to the best of the seller's knowledge. And then number two, they must properly or promptly update the form as new information is learned. Anything that's material, anything that would cost money or change certain requirements or prohibitions in the contract. So if we keep going down, this should not look any different. You've got the type of association, and I'll take this 1 second to remind people that we're seeing a large number of subdivisions converting from voluntary and becoming mandatory. So I think back in the 70s and 80s, they had all these subdivisions that were built for families, and they made being a member of the pool voluntary. Sounds reasonable. But as those subdivisions aged and the people that lived there aged, and the kids didn't use the pool anymore, maybe they moved out, all those HOAs started really having budget problems. So fast forward 30 years, even 40 years, a lot of those HOAs, in order to meet those budget requirements, are converting, and they're making a deal with the current owner. They're saying, hey, you can have full access to all the recreational facilities. You're not required to be a member, but if you sell, it will be converted into mandatory ownership for your buyer. And there's no downside for the seller, seemingly, because they're not paying or changing anything regarding their membership. But it does change things for this disclosure. So keep that in mind. If you've got an older subdivision, ask them, it's voluntary. Let's double check, make sure it hasn't turned over to mandatory. So if that were the case, you would highlight that this is a mandatory membership. Homeowners association buyer will have to pay annual dues and be a member, and so on and so forth. So that's a big deal. Contact person is also a big deal. Closing attorneys need that information to order the closing letters ahead of time. If you don't put that information in there, we're having to reach out to the seller, asking for the information and kind of bugging them, maybe a week or 10 days after we actually get the file, which obviously that slows us down by that much time. So that's a big deal there. But let's go to the part that really did change. And really, I'm going to use this not to just highlight on what's changed, but just to highlight the form in general. So the big thing down here is what changed. At closing, buyer shall be required no more than blank. So you got to fill in a number if you're the seller. For all transfer, initiation, administration fees, seller shall pay any amount in excess of this sum, even in the event any later disclosures made by the seller of increases in such fees. All transfer, initiation, administration fees paid by seller pursuant to the section are considered actual seller fees and are not a seller concession or contribution to the buyer's cost to close. In the event the seller fills in the above blank with NA or is left empty, it shall be the same as seller filling in the above blank with $0. That's all new language, but the way we interpret the form has not changed. They're just trying to be a little clearer. The first conversation you had with the buyer and seller wasn't terribly clear as to what happens if not all the fees are shown. This does a better job. This is a better communication, better conversation. So it's saying seller has to give a disclosure of what the fees are, and that would include not just what's listed there, but anything. It could include capital contribution fee, new account setup fees, any sort of deposits, anything like that. It can include anything. It's everything and anything. And at least the nice thing, they don't make us distinguish or define what each one of those fees is for. They just tell us a round number. We just need a total number. So if in a hypothetical scenario, you've got a $500 initiation fee, a $100 account setup fee, and a $100 new pool key fee, something like that. So you've got $700 in total fees that are going to be paid by the buyer if it's disclosed. So if we put in a number, and we said it was 700, or if I did a typo and said 400, so let's say it's 700. In this scenario, the buyer is obligated to paying up to $700 in those fees, those HOA fees. So initiation fee, new account setup fee, and the pool fob fee. So, but if instead, there's a vote down at the board, the HOA board, or the property management company changes the fees last second. Maybe you had a closing a month ago and it was 700, but now, fast forward 1 month, it's 900. Who's going to pay the difference? So the seller disclosed 700 based on information that was available at the time. Now it's 900. You update the form because it said you had to do that. You had to promptly update the form. But who pays for that? Who pays for that difference? I'm going to leave that to you guys to decide. I want you to give me an answer in the chat feature. So please update it, because this goes to Sarah's question. Sarah says, we've been told in previous classes that even if the seller updates the CAD after initial copy, including the contract, they are liable for what was in the original. Why is the seller not covered if they provide the original information on the CAD prior to closing? So that she's not incorrect, and that is still the case. Even if it's updated, it doesn't change who has to pay that difference. But they do make it a requirement to update it. They say promptly update it, but promptly update material changes. If it doesn't change what the buyer has to pay, it may not be material. Basically, the answer to you, Sarah, let's see if I can click through this. If we go down to the next page, it talks about the warranties. So it says here, seller shall pay any amount in excess of the sum. So I haven't seen anyone answer this question yet. Who would pay the difference if it said 700, it needs to be 900? Who would pay the difference? So seller pays the excess of that sum. There's your answer. Just have to do some math for me. All transfer initiation fees paid by seller pursuant to the section are considered actual fees. In the event filler fills out this, it shall be same as the seller filling in the 0. Seller pays 200. Thank you, Sarah. So that's right. So the seller would pay the $200 difference. The buyer would pay the 700. Would you make up that full 900? The answer to your question, Sarah, is that the seller is warranting at the time of the contract that these numbers are right. So even if you disclose it later, it doesn't relieve the seller's liability to have to pay that difference. They used to have that as part of this form, maybe 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. It said that the seller could update the form up until a couple days before DD ended. So that's the way they used to do it, but it doesn't do that anymore. Now it's just at the time of the disclosure, at the time of the of going binding. So let's see. I'm trying to think where it exactly says that. Seller pay any amount of the sum, even if the event of any later disclosures made by seller increases. So even if you disclose it, and it's just what it says. That's just what the form says, and that's the easiest answer for you, Sarah, is that they're saying even if you update because you're required to, it doesn't change who pays for that difference. Now, the biggest issue is when it's left blank. And it's not a windfall, in my opinion. I don't think that's anyone wins when it's not disclosed ahead of time. And here's my reasoning for that. I talked earlier about contract being a conversation between a buyer and seller. Well, how can you have a real conversation with someone if you're totally missing a major part of this transaction? Yeah, the buyer might make out with not having to spend an extra $900 or $700 in closing costs. I get that. That's definitely a positive for the buyer, but the sellers can be really upset. And they may not be upset with the buyer. They might be upset with themselves. They might be upset with their broker. And that creates this energy, this negative energy that tends to permeate through everything else. Because once you realize that you've made that mistake, you're probably not going to be as kind with, pre-closing occupancy or, leaving furniture behind or cleaning up or hiring a professional, cleaner to come in and clean up. You lose out on that seller really wanting to do right by the buyer because they're already $1,000 in the hole. And I think that's really unfortunate. So when I look at deals like this, I don't encourage one party to win and one party to lose. I think we just need to have everything written out ahead of time. That's the point. And if you're the listing agent, obviously you would feel awful for making a mistake if that was your mistake. But it's also a reason why you want to make this the seller's responsibility. You can do it as a benefit to them. You can say, hey, as a courtesy, I'd be happy to do this for you. But there's a lot of risk there, and it's hard to educate your seller about that risk. Because at the end of the day, they may say they're not upset with you, but if you got it wrong, they're probably going to be upset, and it's probably going to be at you. So I hope that answers it. It's really this section, this sentence right here, seller shall pay any amount in excess, even in the event of any later disclosures. So let's see what else it says. Language added also addresses that if a special assessment is paid in installments, buyer will pay installments due after closing unless the parties agree otherwise in writing. So in the highlight down at the bottom, in the event seller fills out, oh, that's the wrong highlight. Who pays disclosed seller assessments? Installment payments due subsequent to closing shall be paid by buyer. Now, special assessments are difficult. They're really hard to be consistent about because every special assessment is different. And a lot of times it has to do with how the paperwork was done by the HOA, what was disclosed, and basically how this was filled out. I know there's a condo in Midtown that currently has 2 special assessments for different things. One is for breezeways and stairs, the other is for the roof. And they're not cheap. They're pretty significant special assessments. And you basically have to look at each one of them and see if they are one-time special assessments that, a loan was taken out to pay for them over time. In that case, it's dealt with one way. Or is it a one-time special assessment, or is it a multi-special assessment, like they're assessing you every year, $1,000, or are they taking out a $15,000 loan? Which one is it? And it has a lot to do with, is it payable at closing in full? Was this really just a loan, a bridge loan to get the seller to closing or to when it's fully paid off? Or are these individual assessments that are being sent again and again? And my recommendation to you, this is how I do it. I take it on a case-by-case basis. I don't, memorize this part of the form because every time it changes. What I do is I really try and focus on the property. So if I come across a property, whether I'm a listing agent or the selling agent, and I know about special assessments, I'm going to dig and dig and dig to find out what are the special assessments, what's the pricing, what are they going to be paid, and then let's just do a special step. Let's make it super clear. Let's make sure the conversation is being had where we know that the buyer's going to pay a portion, the seller's going to pay a portion, or if the buyer's not paying any of it, then that's accounted for in the purchase price, whatever it may be, whatever it is. It just needs to be disclosed. But let's look at what this language says in general. Special assessments. To the best of seller's knowledge, there is or is not a special assessment that is owing. Seller warrants, down here, that seller has accurately and fully disclosed to buyer all special assessments passed under consideration to buyer. This warranty shall survive closing. And then it goes into what we do if. So if a special assessment is owing to or under consideration by the association or any master association, it is already passed or under consideration. Under consideration is, you've heard about it in the meetings, that you know that there's a vote that's going to be coming up, you have to disclose it and what the estimated amount is, and or already passed by the master association or under consideration by master association. Liability. So this talks about who's liable with respect to the special assessment under consideration or approved before binding agreement date that are either not disclosed or not disclosed accurately by seller. The seller shall be liable for and shall reimburse buyer for that portion of the special assessment that was either not disclosed or not disclosed accurately. So if you don't say anything about it, then the seller's obligated for all of it. Who pays for the disclosed special assessment? So this is where we really have to determine what kind of assessment is it. So under consideration or approved and accurately disclosed above, if an unpaid special assessment is due but may be paid in installments, it shall be deemed due in installments for purposes of determining whether it's paid by buyer or seller. So if the special assessment is adopted and due in whole or being paid by installment payments due prior to or on closing shall be paid by the seller. And installment payments due subsequent or after closing shall be paid by the buyer. So that's really the key. If these are installment payments, the seller is going to pay everything due up to and at closing. So if it says, hey, we've been paying installments, but the whole thing is due at closing, then the seller is going to pay all of that. And then if any of it is due after closing and they're paid in installments, then it's paid by the buyer, assuming it was actually disclosed. And then special assessments rising after binding agreement date. If you remember earlier, it talks about that the seller is warranting this and shall survive closing. So let's look at this. So if they're under consideration after the binding agreement date are promptly disclosed by seller to buyer, it talks about what they would do. So if the special assessment is adopted and due in whole or in part prior to or on closing, that portion due prior to shall be paid by the seller. So again, they split it up and make a distinction. As the special assessment is adopted and due in whole or in part subsequent or after closing, that portion due shall be paid by the buyer. Makes sense. So notwithstanding the above, if the buyer's portion of special assessment that is under consideration or approved is blank or more, buyer shall have the right but not the obligation to terminate. You know, really what I'm going to look at for this is any HOA with a significant amount of assets, common elements, or condo association. Any condo association, I'm spending some real time thinking about this. I want, and it really gives me the education to see what I need to look for. When I evaluate an HOA or condo, I want to see not only the covenants, and I don't really want to read the covenants, that sounds obnoxious. I actually was downloading one for a client earlier today that was 97 pages. And I'm not recommending anybody read 97 pages, but if you have a dog, if you have, if you're worried about the pool or you're worried about the lake and you want to know specifically about that lake or about those issues, you can download the 97 pages and look specifically for that issue. I think that's a great way to kind of meander through that without overwhelming yourself. And when we talk about special assessments, I want to look at the budget. I want to look at the profit and loss statements. I want to look at the reserve studies. Condominiums do reserve studies every couple of years, 3 to 5 years, that basically reevaluate how much money is in reserve compared to what the maintenance and repair items are going to be. That's really helpful to knowing should a special assessment be there or not. It gives us that heads up. So I think that's probably all we need to talk about for the community association form. Again, it's a really, really well done form at this point. I never used to be able to say that, but it does a really good job of saying the seller needs to disclose these fees, and if they don't, the seller has to pay it, even if it's disclosed later. It's in black and white. It's really straightforward. It talks also about closing letters, but we've seen that before. You know, if there's a closing letter due at or prior to closing, it doesn't get reimbursed. All of this stuff can be changed with a special stipulation. So if you think it's not fair that the seller have to pay things or any of this stuff, put it in a special step, change the contract, change the wording. Let's see if I have any, I don't have any chat, so I'm just going to keep going. So closing attorney acting as holder of earnest money exhibit. This is a form that I hope you guys don't have to use all that much. It's F511 and it goes together with F510. It's only if the closing attorney is holding the earnest money. And I know Harry Norman would recommend that you guys always hold it, whether you're on the buy or the sell side. So I would highly recommend it. But really, they've tried to make it easier for us to kind of follow the procedures. It's a pretty strict procedure for the attorneys. Basically, the closing attorney can choose whether to only accept wires or to also accept checks. But it's tricky. There's a lot of extra paperwork, and just know that if you are asking the closing attorney to hold earnest money, they have extra obligations, and that is F511, which is right here, and it just talks about the terms. The big thing is the closing attorney has to agree to hold the earnest money. So every other day I'm having to sign on this second page right there. And then I have to disclose to everybody when I receive the earnest money. But if I fail in either of those duties, it could potentially put your contract at risk. And I don't want you to have to worry about that. So number 4, sale or lease of buyer's property contingency exhibit. This is obviously a very big deal, and probably more so now than almost any time in the last 3 years, because even in these higher price points, over $500,000, we're seeing significant competition for one property. You might have 5 offers on a $600,000 home that just hit the market. And the sale or lease contingency is typically part of that. You've got, in that scenario, you've got a buyer who's probably trading up. This is their move-up home. or maybe they're forever home, and they've got to sell their other home in order to do it. Not everyone has to do that, but if they want that protection, that if their other home doesn't sell, they can back out of this contract, you need to know this form very well, obviously. So this is the sale or lease of buyer's property contingency exhibit. Let's see if I can pull that one up. Yep, there it is. I went too far. All right, so it's F601. So buyer warrants that buyer owns the real property located at, and this is the other property, and they call it other property. And I wanted to point that out because it's really helpful when you're writing special steps or you're referring to this other property. You just make sure it's capitalized, and it's called a defined term. So if you say, the other property shall be sold within 3 days or something, it's a lot easier than having to restate the other property located at, you wouldn't have to do all that. So here's where they really clarified, they kind of simplified how this agreement reads. So this agreement contingent upon the occurrence of the following on or before, and here's the tricky part. A lot of people feel obligated to put a date, and you might put your original closing date. Let's say it's November 1st, 2020. You put that on there. Well, you might get an extension. Maybe there's an 8-day unilateral extension. So there are two options. And you might even have a COVID extension or a mutual extension, any other reason. So really, what I would probably recommend is you put in closing date. So you just do capital term, capital letters, and let's see if I can get to it. My mouse is hiding on. There we go. So I would probably just put closing date. And that's a defined term for this property. And it basically says that as the closing date for this agreement, your purchase and sale agreement, as that adjusts or changes, then we can change, then this sale contingency changes with it, which can be very, very helpful. So that's one problem we typically see, because if you put the actual closing date, you put November 1st and it later extends, now you're kind of unsure, does this extend with it? So you could put closing date, you could add a special step saying, in the event that the other property is extended, or that this agreement is extended due to any number, due to an amendment, this sale contingency shall extend simultaneously. You could do something like that. But I just want to point that out because I don't want you to have that scare later. The other option is you just put November 10th. So that would at least cover you through an 8-day unilateral extension. And so you might want to think about that. Just, put a date. You've got that contingency. If it doesn't sell before November 10th, you could terminate, or you can negotiate some sort of extension. The nice thing is that it would give you the leverage to negotiate an extension in that event. So you're not dead in the water either way. I just would want to protect you up front if possible. So you have, before it said sale or lease, and it was, I think they were finding that it was obligating a seller to find a lease if they couldn't sell, and so they're trying to avoid that. Now you get to choose, and you can choose both, or you can choose just one or the other. But the first one is closing on the sale of the other property, or entering into a lease of the other property of at least so many months, or weeks, or days, or even years. So I would say most people are probably going to choose option number one, buyer closing on the sale of other property. In the event, and this is why I want you to pay extra close attention to what date you put in above. So in the event the contingency period ends without either contingency reference above being fulfilled, then at that time this agreement shall terminate. It's automatic. It happens whether you want it to or not, unless you do something about it. So prior to seller giving buyer notice that seller is exercising the kickout clause, as that term is explained below, the contingency or contingencies referenced above may be waived by buyer upon notice to the seller. In such event, the kickout clause below shall no longer be part of the agreement. Buyer shall have no obligation to deposit additional earnest money. So let's talk about what a kickout clause is. In a short number of words, it's really just someone saying, hey, I like your offer, but you've got a lot of contingencies on there, and I'd rather be able to shop it for a better offer if possible. We'll let you do your contingencies. We'll let you do your due diligence, hire your inspector, get an appraisal, do all that stuff. But I'm going to keep it on the market. And, if I get a better offer, I'm going to come back and I'm going to tell you about it. We had an interesting scenario. One of your colleagues called me a couple weeks ago and said that their buyer wanted to make an offer on a property that had a kick-out provision. And it was the first time I'd ever heard something quite like this, but they wanted to make their offer $25,000 more than the current agreement, which they didn't know the number of. They just said, buyers shall pay purchase price at least $25,000 more than the existing agreement that is currently under contract. I don't remember exactly how we wrote the language. And so it was an escalation clause on a current contract. And the question was, could the seller use that to terminate that first contract? Almost like an escalation clause where they get to choose and the other buyer's got to come up, got to keep coming up. So let me know how you guys might think of that. Throw it into the comments. I would love to see what your preference would be. But let's look at the form. So kick-out clause says that you're continuing to market, and if you get a good offer, if you get a bona fide offer from a third party, then you can share that with your current buyer, and the buyer either has to terminate or drop their contingencies. It actually does not allow the seller to make the buyer come up in price. It doesn't allow the seller to terminate. It doesn't allow them to do any of that. It just says, hey, buyer, I got this offer. If you're in, I want you to tell me you're all the way in. So let's look at the second page. They have simplified the way this form works, and you just choose exactly what you expect this contract to be. So selection option 1 or option 2. If no option is selected, then this agreement shall not be subject to a kick-out clause. And you don't have to make a sale contingency subject to a kick-out clause. So let's look at option number 1. This agreement is subject to a kick-out clause in the event seller receives a bona fide offer to purchase the property. Bona fide means just a legitimate offer, not from a family member or some sort of fake offer. Bona fide would mean a legitimate offer that the seller would like to accept. And seller shall give notice of the offer to buyer. Buyer then has so many hours to deposit additional earnest money. You could put 0. It's all negotiable. You could put 100,000, whatever it is, and deliver seller an amendment to this agreement signed by buyer in which buyer agrees to remove from the agreement the contingencies below. And so this is great because it allows us to very clearly say what happens if we're going to waive our contingencies or which contingencies we're going to waive. So let's say in this scenario, we select option 1, and then there's A or B. A, all contingencies and due diligence periods will no longer be part of this agreement. So that's a pretty extreme thing. And you've got to be very careful. So let's say you get your sale contingency, you get the kick-out clause in there, and you choose that the buyer's got to put down no earnest money, no extra earnest money, but within 24 hours, they've got to remove every contingency. And that could be due diligence, financing, appraisal, sale contingency, everything. It could be, a survey contingency. It could be anything because you have a general contingency form. I'd say that's the most extreme version of this, and the only buyers that should be willing to do that would be ones that are paying all cash or don't really need the sale contingency or just being cautious, because then they could still back out if they needed to. And then B, which I would probably recommend instead, is you get to choose exactly what happens if the seller brings another offer. So you remove the sale contingency, you remove due diligence, you remove the right to request repairs or any financing or appraisal contingencies. You can even remove special steps, which I love, that the buyer shall, so hypothetically, you're under contract, you put in that there's going to be additional $2,000 of earnest money, and then these following items have to be removed. The sale or lease contingency has to be removed. The due diligence has to be removed. And by the way, I'm not getting it professionally cleaned anymore. And so that would be special stipulation 3. You could do it that way. I think that would be pretty sharp. But be very, very careful. Removing a sale contingency for a buyer that needs it is a major risk that you need to make sure you disclose properly to a buyer. Option 2 is not subject to a kickout clause, but obviously if you don't choose anything, it's not subject to it as well. So, Shu, what's the, oh, Sarah has another question. Let's see, an agent in my office recently tried to complete this form. An option 1B form only allows you to check one box. She wrote in other that all contingencies will remain in place. Yeah, you don't have to check any. And maybe your accounting firm department or your auditing department would disagree with me, but you probably aren't subject to much of a kickout clause unless they're doing something. So in that scenario, I would probably think that they were doing an additional earnest money, but not removing contingencies. I could see that, although I don't know, that doesn't move the needle very much for me. But I think you could just leave it unchecked. I don't know if that's correct or not. Ashu says, in giving buyer notice of the offer, is seller required to send the written offer? I've seen a situation where buyer insisted on it, and I took the position the seller didn't have to provide the document. I think it says in there, Ashu, so let's look. I think it's probably in here. So kickout clause. Another buyer makes an offer that the seller wishes to accept. The seller gives notice of the offer to the first buyer, who must then timely submit an amendment. If the first buyer does not have these things within pre-agreed time frame, the seller can kick out the first buyer, terminate that contract, and sell the property. If the buyer meets the pre-agreed requirements, the kickout clause in the original contract remains in force. So it doesn't say it there, Shu. In the terms. I feel like it says it somewhere, Shu, but it may not. It may not address it. Whether you actually have to share that other offer. Now, I will make here's my 2 cents on verifying bona fide offers. It's a crapshoot. You know, I remember when I was applying for high school jobs and I put on my resume that I worked for this, this prominent attorney in town. It was my dad's business partner. It was an inside deal the whole way through, right? So there was no way, there was not very much information that you could have gained just from looking at the face of an agreement. Hopefully it doesn't get me in trouble with you, Shu. But I think the same thing for escalation clauses. I think you have that same issue of how do you verify a bona fide offer, another offer. And my one thing that I keep going back to is call the broker. So I feel like, maybe an agent would be more willing to twist the truth or not share that information. But if you call the broker and now you're putting it into their court as to whether they're buying for them or not, I think that's really helpful. And personally, I don't want to spend a ton of time verifying bona fide offers. I just want to go right to the broker or to whomever I can, the best source I can, see if that person can verify it, just say, hey, yep, that's a bona fide offer, this was the price. That's enough for me. I think that works because I've heard the gamut. I've heard where you ask them to bring a copy of the contract to closing. I've seen where you ask them to send a redacted version of the contract. Well, at that point, what do you have? You really don't have much. So call the broker. If you call Mary Beth or you call Shay or anybody that is running an office, hopefully their standard of care, their interest in fudging numbers is very low or unlikely. So I think that's what I would recommend, especially if it's a legitimate broker, the Harry Normans of the world, or what I'm referring to in that case. But if it's a buyer that's demanding that verification, that's tough because it looks like in this form they don't specifically give the right or the requirement for the seller to disclose the existence. But if the seller was charged on it and that they were, hopefully they had a good moral compass and they weren't doing this just to make the buyer move quickly. I'm not so sure. Sarah says you can't check multiple. I think there's a problem with the form. Maybe that's Sarah. So maybe that is a the software that you're using. I know the form itself would permit it. If you just did a PDF or something like that, it would certainly permit it. But maybe it is an issue with with the form with your software. I could see that. I haven't played with it yet. Sarah, what software do you use on that? Is that RDocs or is it just FMLS? Let me know what you guys are using. But that could just be a form thing. But if you did put other, that does make sense. That would be a good workaround if you had to. But obviously in that scenario, the seller's not really gaining much if nothing gets removed. You know, obviously if you put a little bit more earnest money, that helps, but sale contingencies go right up to closing usually. And so that doesn't really help out a seller a whole lot to have that kickout clause and to keep the property marketed. I think that makes it tough. It's probably not how I would do it. I'm not going to have a ton of time to talk about this, but what I probably would recommend in that scenario would be an option money. So option money is also on the first page of F201, and it just simply talks about money that is non-refundable and paid directly to the seller. And it's consideration for that due diligence period. It's saying, hey, because you're giving me a due diligence period, I'll pay you $1,000. And so I kind of like that as an option instead. You have the kickout clause, you say, all right, you've already put your $5,000 down for earnest money, you have this really nasty sale contingency, but if I get another good bona fide offer, I'm going to check other, and you're going to have to deposit $5,000 as option money directly with the seller. And you know, it shall be credited to the purchase price. And you can borrow that language directly from F201. I mean, that's what the form's about. It's that section, option money, is really, really cool because you are guaranteeing a seller a certain amount of money, even if they use one of the contingencies to terminate the contract. So even if the buyer terminates because of the sale contingency or terminates because of due diligence or whatever it may be, the option money is paid and in the seller's hand, and it compensates them for keeping the house generally off the market during the entire sale contingency. So I would look at that, and we could do a whole class on option money, but it's exactly what that's for, is to guarantee a certain amount of money to the seller. There was a couple other forms that I wanted to go over. That is the meat and potatoes of the mid-year changes, but there were a couple others regarding the listing agreements. So let's look at those. Amendment to remove contingency of sale or lease. This is the form you would use. This has been updated as well. So in this, pursuant to the terms of this agreement, sellers provide buyer with a notice of seller's receipt of a second offer for purchase of the property. And then they're going to be doing this. We're going to pay additional earnest money, and we're going to remove all the provisions per the agreement, and then we're going to sign it. And so this is the amendment that they're talking about when a buyer is going to move forward and drop those contingencies. Let's see, hopefully it's still sharing the right form. Yes, it looks like it is. Okay, so exclusive seller listing agreement. You know, this is another form that really encourages a conversation between the buyer and seller. So I really want to spend a few minutes on this one. This was updated as of May. It wasn't majorly updated. They do have this disclaimer up top: state law prohibits broker from representing seller as a client without first entering into a written agreement with seller under OCGA 10.6A1, etc. So that, just remember, this is a requirement. It's why here Norman requires it as well. And what I'm noticing more and more recently is that we're not describing the property properly. And if it's wrong on the purchase and sale agreement, it's going to be wrong on your listing agreement. And that's a major issue if you're trying to enforce someone paying commissions. You know, if the deal falls apart, there's a default by the buyer or the seller, you need to be able to enforce it. And if you haven't described the property well enough, it's not a binding contract. So that would be worst case. That's what every litigator is going to look at in the event. So that should be a top priority when you're doing these listing agreements. And then I've also seen, and I think you guys are probably one of the best at this, is just filling in this commission section properly. I don't always go based on what I was trained. I go after whatever the form says. So I want you to take personal ownership as to ensuring that this form is filled out correctly. And then number 10, I know you all have seen this, but I want to take a minute and remind you that how important this part is. Special circumstances. This should be when you find out they're getting a divorce. This should be when you find out there's a bankruptcy, or that there's a short sale, or a reverse mortgage, or someone's not on title, or they flipped it and they just bought it. This is the moment where they tell you there's a lien, not 1 week before closing. It's so important because you could spend 6 months listing the property, negotiating everything with the seller, walking them through it, holding their hand, and the week before closing, you find out there's a major issue that you were never told about. And that's a major liability for a seller and ultimately for you, because it potentially means you're not getting paid. So I would spend a lot of attention. I would see this form and make sure that if there's anything on here or should be on here that could delay closing, that you reach out to someone at Campbell Brannon or a closing attorney you respect, to help you get that resolved before you put it on the market. Assuming that it was done, or taking the seller's advice that yes, that's handled, probably isn't enough anymore, because too many things are closed, things take too long to fix after the fact. So I would definitely look into that more rather than less. And so yeah, we've done the community association form. The conventional loan contingency was also updated. I don't think it was updated that extremely, but it was updated. I think it just changed a couple of the wording. Nothing too crazy. The big thing on here, you always, as a listing agent, you want 1 or 2 or as few people on here as possible. And if you're a selling agent, you want none, because that gives your buyer the most options if you don't have anybody listed. And if they're going to list someone, you can always ask them to throw in your person too. Oh, I know you've been talking with Wells Fargo, but talk to Prosperity. Just put it on there just in case, because if you ever switch to that lender, you want them to be on this form. And I think that is basically it. I don't have any chats right now. Does anyone have any questions or have any questions for me? Those are the big changes for the year, for the mid-year. Obviously, we'll probably see more come January. But if no one else has any questions, feel free to email me. Email me at cross@campbellandbrandon.com or cross@cb.law. Both of those emails will work, or you can call me. And hopefully, if you ever find yourself in East Cobb, I'd love to handle one of your closings. But I'm just waiting for someone to say they need me. Thank you, Ashu. I appreciate that. Well, let me sign out. I don't want to take any more of your time. But good luck with everything, everybody. Stay safe. And, if you can continue to shelter in place while continuing to do closings, I think you probably should. We're seeing we want you guys to be safe. So best of luck, everybody, and call me if you need me. Thanks.